Hey, I'm Dana. I'm part of the Squirrel Squad, and we're back again with, I think, our third conversation. And today it's going to be about motivation and how hard it is for people with ADHD, whatever your age. But first, why don't we all introduce ourselves so you know who we are?
I'm Audrey. Hi.
I'm Bevan.
I'm Kara.
And I'm Dana.
Yay.
Okay, so do we want to talk about motivation? It's really challenging for people with ADHD. It's also hard for people with anxiety because of the way their brain works and this inability to, well, several things. One is the inability to plan and organize and do all that, which means it's harder to get started. But also, if you don't like what you're doing, it's very hard to just use willpower to make ourselves get something done. So we all have different ways that we work with our clients or for ourselves of making that first step, of making it easier, things like that. So, and why we have problems is the dopamine deficiency in our brains. So the best way to motivate is finding some way that that person's dopamine gets a dopamine hit, that their person's brain, right? And that's going to be different for everyone. Not all of the things we're going to talk about works for everybody. But for instance, pairing something you like with something you dislike, right? So I have a college student who hates writing papers. But if she goes out and gets herself a really good Starbucks or whatever type of coffee and sits in the coffee shop, she can get it started. Because for her, it works. I have other people, especially the younger kids, who love something I call it's called body doubling. So it makes it more social. You work with somebody. You don't have to be working on the same thing. You just have a friend over. This worked with my daughter hugely when she was little. We would get a play date over and would say, okay, snack, do the homework, and then you can go play. And that took a lot of the stress off, a lot of the moaning, a lot of the 5 hours of homework for something that should take an hour, because it was just easier for her to have that. And, Squirrel Squad, we actually use this too. Okay, so somebody else chime in because I'm talking too much.
Never.
I could go on this all day, so.
I think like identifying for yourself or your kid or clients' kids, identifying like why you're having trouble being motivated with whatever it is such a good place to start, because like you said, Dana, it could be like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't know how to plan. I don't know how to get from here to there. So like, I'm just going to check out and not even shut down. So maybe it's overwhelm, or maybe it's fear, or maybe it, like you said, maybe it's a low dopamine activity. So it's not tied to an interest or something that one likes to do. And so taking a step back and for yourself or brainstorming with your kid, okay, why does this feel really hard right now? Is so helpful, because then you could probably help figure out what a good solution might be to try. If
Yeah, great
it
point.
feels overwhelming, okay, we're gonna, buy double. I'm gonna help you move through a plan. If it is something like, oh, I just don't like doing this thing. Okay, so we got to figure out how to make it a little bit more interesting. How to, so helping to kind of match the source of the struggle with what might be the solution is a really good place to start. And a lot of times, like, we just avoid and we don't, the
Yes.
avoiding's working. And so we don't actually take a step back to recognize why it's hard.
Yeah, that's really true.
So many great points from both of you. And that motivation, something with the body doubling that you both brought up or talked about, is sometimes it works for a parent to do the body doubling. And sometimes, especially as they become teenagers, you've got to find somebody else, because no matter what, teens like to push against parents. And so if you try and do it or suggest it, They're like, oh no, that's the worst idea. That won't work for me. But if you can find someone else to make that suggestion or say, hey, would you like to come and sit down and work next to me while I'm doing this? If it comes from someone other than parents, it's like, oh, that's the best idea. Why didn't my parents think of that? Why didn't I think of that? So consider reaching out to someone else, another trusted adult or a friend, or maybe there's another home where the child is less rebellious with their parent, and maybe that parent would be willing to host a body doubling session where kids can go and do homework together, and it doesn't feel so bad to be in that space. So, because yeah, that what it takes for each individual, and I've got 3 kids, and what each of them needs is very different from one another. So it does not matter that they're being raised in the same household. What each of them needs is completely different. Their motivation is sparked in different ways. So looking at the individual and their needs is so, so, so important.
Yeah, you make a great point on the adolescent part too, as they're getting older, because then some of it becomes sort of control, right? Like it becomes a power struggle if you're arguing about homework, or you're trying to control that he does his homework and he's going to control back by not doing his homework. So there's that control, the competence, the connection, like people need different things. And often the less nagging, less reminding, less nudging, less lecturing, less pleading is more from the parent, less is more.
Yeah, that makes me think about what you were saying, Bevan, about getting curious, because I think lacking motivation can look like laziness or not caring, or they just want to be on their phone and they're addicted to their phone. And like it can look a lot of confusing ways from the outside. And I think we can all relate to the feeling of having low motivation. And it doesn't feel like not caring and it doesn't feel relaxing. It doesn't feel like I don't know, like you're getting away with something. It's like usually a feeling of doom and frustration, and you need to get it done. And why can't you just get it done? And it's usually not also that they don't know what needs to be done. So sometimes parents are, me, myself too, it's like, oh, let me just explain to them again what needs to happen. And usually they know very well what needs to happen. It's the doing it that is hard.
Yeah.
And so I think, some days it's just like, do I need rest and a break because I'm just not going to get there? Or is there, there are a lot of other tools we try, like you guys have already said a lot of great ones. I think something I like to think about is that sometimes motivation isn't the thing that's going to make us do the thing. It's actually an action. And then once you get going, you might feel motivated. But to wait to feel like I want to do it is like, I think, a very big ADHD trap that I also fall into, because, then you're always asking yourself, like, do I feel like doing it now? And it's like, no, I don't actually. Or sometimes if we make a plan ahead of time, like that's where routines can help, or deciding the night before. Like I think about meal planning, and when you can decide what you're going to eat the next day, and then the next day you just eat it. You're not like asking, what do I want to eat? Do I have what I need to make that food? Like it can make it a lot easier to get it done. And then I guess the last thing I was thinking about is that emotional discomfort that is part dopamine and then part emotional regulation, of being able to be uncomfortable doing something you really don't want to do and do it anyway. And that's definitely a skill. It takes a lot of regulation. If you can stay regulated so your kid can do it, that helps a lot. Or body doubling, right, is where we can sometimes borrow regulation from somebody else so that we can get past it and do the hard thing. So motivation.
A couple of thoughts that have worked for some people is moving while they're doing something. So reading aloud if they hate to read, and walking around while they're doing that, if you're doing sort of a homework type of thing. I have one client who she does have a to-do list, but she now has a not to-do list as well. because that kind of keeps her from doing this stuff like, I'm not going to go on my phone. I'm not going to do this. And for her, she finds that helpful. Like she just does. And obviously, Bevan, you mentioned the overwhelm, breaking it down into itty bitty pieces and making sure that whether it's for me or for a client, making sure that they are specific. So this idea of like, oh, I'll put it in my calendar. Great, really good. Also, you can learn to ignore that sound, or you cannot look at your calendar, or you can ignore your calendar. So having other ways, either a whiteboard, because then you can see it, out of sight is out of mind, is a great thing to think, because then you're not as frustrated when your kid isn't doing what they said they do. Or breaking something down, but then actually just write an outline or just read 5 pages as the goal in the calendar. Not so when you sit down, you don't just see English paper. Ugh. Like, no, run away. But if it's come up with a title and 3 questions that you want to address in the paper, okay, I can do that. So those are just a couple things that also work for me. In music, having a playlist for how long, if you don't want to shower, for instance, have a playlist. You have to stay in the shower for 3 minutes because whether you use soap or not, we need you to be cleaner. Okay, I can do it if I'm listening to good music. Yeah, I don't know, things like that.
I'm thinking about my youngest and a lot of strategies that have come up with her struggle with avoidance of certain activities that largely fall into things that she would label as boring, which in other words is a low interest or a low dopamine activity. And how she's 10 and I'm trying to help her at this age and stage work with her brain and not against her brain, and recognize that the way that her brain works is different than the way that other kids' brains works, and that's fine and cool. And she's all on board with the whole superpower brain, I've got this awesome brain, but then some things are hard. So she's on board with that idea. And now I'm trying to transition, instead of just accommodating. Lots of body doubling happens in our household, but I'm also trying to help her start to move towards being more of a self-advocate when it comes to things that are hard to do. She's getting to the maturity level where she is starting to accept that things cannot be avoided forever, and that all of her behaviors that come when she's trying to avoid things have gotten her into places she doesn't necessarily want to be. And so we're trying to now, me and her team of teachers, and she has an ADHD coach, we're all trying to arm her with different tools, and specifically around this idea of a low dopamine activity. So last spring, we kind of played around with the concept of a dopamine menu, an idea introduced through Jessica McCabe and her How to ADHD, and the idea that you can kind of come up with things that can either like jumpstart your brain, give it a little boost of dopamine. So that's what they would categorize as an appetizer. So like a 2 to 5 minute little like boost of energy, something physical, listening to a song, something like that. That's just a quick little jolt, and then you do something. Or the idea of the side, which is, and not all activities will this work, but let's say it's putting away your laundry. Kind of boring, don't want to do it, don't feel motivated, low dopamine activity. But if I can do something alongside that, like you were kind of talking about listening to some music or an audiobook or something that makes it more fun, that would be the side. The entree, that would be something that gives a lot of dopamine but takes more time. So those would be things that maybe you would put after the thing you don't want to do, so that you have this thing to look forward to. And then the last one is the desserts, right? So those are the things that can become the easy traps where like a little is fine, but like the scrolling, the YouTube, things like that. So those are the things you do a little bit in moderation, but be careful if you're struggling with motivation, the dessert comes after, similar to how the entree could be. So we played around with that. She wasn't quite developmentally ready, honestly, at 9 last spring for this to be really helpful. But my 12-year-old, who's pretty mature, she loved this and she used this a lot. She doesn't struggle as much with the motivation, but she thought this was a really great strategy. Have any of you guys played around with that or used that strategy, the dopamine menu idea?
Let's do a list of things that you want to do or things that might be a good reward for after, what you can look forward to. You know, do 10 minutes of this, you might unlock 10 minutes on something that you like to do.
Mhm.
And have kind of a running list of rewards
Mhm.
that, you know, to pick from, that kind of go with the amount of time you need to be pushing yourself. So kind of we play with that for sure.
Mhm.
I think it kind of goes along with the Pomodoro method, you know, where you set your time to do something and then you take a short little break. And in that short little break, you do something that will give you that little burst. Other than don't try and watch part of a show because that you can just spiral downward in that.
Mhm.
But for 5 minutes, you go jump on the trampoline or you go and maybe there's like a short YouTube clip where it's easy to watch that short YouTube clip, or you have a snack, you drink some water, you play tag, you know, do
Gamify.
something. Yeah, gamify anything you can. And then you go back and you do your next Pomodoro, which could be anywhere from 5-10 minutes to 25 minutes of sitting down to work on something. And some people don't like that word, like, oh, I've tried Pomodoros and I don't like it. It doesn't work for me. Well, I think sometimes it might not work because maybe you've got to tweak it to fit who you are. And, you know, that the structure of it, it's the idea of it, of let's set aside some time to get our focus on, and then let's take a short break. Get your focus on, take a short break.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, as Dana started off this conversation with, is what works for one person may not work for another, but how can you tweak it to fit your needs?
Does anybody
Yeah.
else feel stressed by the idea of breaks?
That's a good
Depending on
question.
my clients, I do have some that are like, if I stop, I won't ever go back.
Right.
Mhm. That's
Yeah.
a big issue for my brain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, you know, I, like you were talking about Audrey, I'm like, oh, I'll wait till I get, you know,
Yeah,
motivated to
feel
do
like it.
something. If I do, oh gosh, I can't stop.
Right.
Yes.
To keep
Once you're doing
going,
something.
like get the hyper focus going, then you don't want to
Mhm.
have to stop. I kind of feel like I do have clients like that. I mean, I'm like that too. It's like, oh my gosh, the stars are aligned and it's happening. And
Yeah.
if I
Go with it.
cannot
Yeah.
stop, like, I don't think you have to stop when you're in awesome hyper focus. That's a superpower. Like, run with it if you can.
Absolutely.
You know, if you have other things like jobs and kids to feed, sometimes that gets in the way. But I think it's awesome when we can like run with our awesomeness for
Mhm.
sure.
When my kids were little, we also, it kind of was body doubling, but really wasn't aware of it. It was more social. So we had a group of kids who really struggled, like a friend group, but a couple of them really didn't like math and struggled with it. And so they decided to have a math, yeah, they needed you, Kara.
They didn't have Kara.
They did a little math club.
Mhm.
And so, you know, people that were struggling with math, they'd all get together and do the math homework with an adult who, you know, we would vary who it was, who could just help if they were struggling, but often they could also help each other.
Mhm.
And it made them feel not so alone or so like they're the only ones that can't do it. Like, you know, I'm stupid.
Mhm.
And that kind of goes away if you have a group setting. So
Mhm.
yeah, that was really, I thought that was very cool that they did that. and they thought of it themselves. And it really worked for them.
I think that's really well tied. I mean, like we were talking about the body doubling, but
Yeah.
I feel like that is again back tied to something that might produce a certain amount of dopamine that makes it a little easier, that connection, something that my daughter's ADHD coach introduced to her that I heard or read or something way back when, but kind of forgotten about the acronym of pinch
Yeah,
that can
love pinch.
provide the dopamine. So it's pinch, P, play, I, interest, N, novel, so something that is novel, new, C, and that can be a challenge, connection, like the math club, or competition. And then the H is hurry up, or the sense of felt urgency. So all those things are ways that you can boost dopamine. So they are all like good general, kind of broad kind of topics, categories to kind of work from, to keep in mind, again, when you're trying to figure out what thing works for you or what thing works for this specific challenge with motivation, and what could you assign to that from that list of things. That I think it's helpful to keep those things in mind, because we sometimes get stuck with the idea like, oh, it has to be a reward, or it has to be the body doubling. We're like, no, there's the other things. Like, let's force some urgency, because that works real well for me. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that
But
kids do now.
I love that you just said that, because when you said hurry up, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, how many of the kids out there and adults with ADHD who have that deadline? It's like, oh, I got to get this done right now. And you can actually get it done. So
Yeah.
that just was me this week, right? I submitted 2 proposals, and on the due date, which now is extended, but I didn't know that when I submitted. That was the due date. So it can be so much easier to get something done if you have that hurry up, like, oh, this has to be done now.
Mhm.
And I think this is something for us to be aware of. I've been thinking about it with my kids' 504 plans and the accommodation of having extra time.
Mhm.
And how is that extra time helping, or is it hurting?
Mm.
And if they're given that extra time, are they being taught how to use that extra time? Or is it, oh, well, you have extra time, so, get it done, but then you've still got this next assignment coming, then yeah, you'll have extra time. And I think that I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were talking about that, and that if the accommodation, as part of the accommodation, if they're not being taught how to work through their challenge, then that accommodation is never really going to help them if they don't learn how to work with the challenge
Mm.
and build on their strategies. So as part of how we work with our kids and their accommodations is, how can we teach them to hurry, to meet a deadline, to work through that pain where it can physically feel painful, that, oh my gosh, I've got all this stuff to do and I don't know where to start, and how do I get it done? And I'm not motivated to do it because I want to go hang out with my friends, or I want to go play video games, or I want to go do these fun things that I love doing. And so that's where, working with your team, who is part of your team, other parents, friends, teachers, school, whomever, coaches, to work together to help with that motivation, to help that hurry or whatever is needed.
Mhm.
Kara. I kind of wanted to go back, Bevan, to the question about the dopamine menu, because I like the idea of an appetizer, because I think, at least for me, and I think kind of in our generation, there's that whole idea of doing the hard thing before you have fun.
Mhm.
And that does work for some people. And for a lot of people, a lot of kids too, when they get home from school, they're already out, they're tapped. And so to say you can't play your video game or you can't talk to your friends until you're done, I think about it as mountain biking, or like there's a big hill and it's like when they're completely done and you're out of dopamine, out of motivation, and you try to like climb up a really steep hill from a stop, it's like impossible. It feels so hard. And so sometimes, whether it's a moment of connection or a dance party to a song or a good snack and conversation about the day, or just, or even like, some video game time before, just some decompression time, then it's kind of like you have some momentum going, you got a little dopamine going, so you can get up the hill, and then it doesn't feel as daunting and impossible.
Yeah, dance party for the
So
rain.
yeah,
Or
totally.
puddle stomping was another one. It was
Mhm.
rainy.
So it's nice to sometimes question the thought that the hard thing has to happen first. Like I can't, because some of these kids, honestly, they're always waiting for connection. If you're going to withhold connection until they do the thing, they might never get it. Like I remember one of my brothers, the teacher had taken away all recess for the entire school year. And she came to my stepmom like, what do I do now? And she's like, he has to go outside and play. He has to. He has to be able
Has
to
to.
move. Like, this isn't working. And I think the teacher ended up crying, like feeling like she didn't know what to do. But the idea of withholding things that bring pleasure in the thought that it's going to increase motivation for this demographic, for the our awesome neurosparkly people, it doesn't usually work out well.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And at the same time, I think what that thing is matters a lot. And that's as we're really getting into the deep end and trying to support my 10-year-old with this really big challenge for her. One of the things that we pinpointed was there may be some things that are the concept of like the fun sandwich, right? Where you do something fun before, and then then you're doing the thing you have that you're maybe avoiding or struggling with, and then there's something to look forward to in the end. We've been talking about that with my daughter, which that it was a little bit easier concept than the dopamine menu or where she is. But what we started to recognize is her default was always drawing, super, super high interest. She loves art, wants to be an illustrator. But then she had such a hard time with transitioning off of that activity that was meant to be her appetizer, was meant to be the 2 to 5 minutes. And 100% anything involving a screen would be there too. That transitioning from that super high dopamine activity to the one that's the low dopamine was impossible. And so then we'd get all these behaviors, avoidant behaviors. So what we're working on with her sandwich is the appetizers type things have to be things that certainly boost dopamine, certainly are things she enjoys, but will not hijack her attention. She'll get so involved with this thing that transitioning off of it will feel impossible. Or like when she comes off it and now faces the low interest activity, that it will struggle that much more.
And
So
transitions are so hard for them in general.
absolutely,
Folks in
transitions are
general.
really tough too, cause a lot of anxiety. So the solution that we're coming up for her within the classroom, but I'm going to do it at home, and this was kind of something we started chatting together, was I'm going to be over the weekend putting together a dopamine toolkit. And within this toolkit in the classroom, and we'll have one for home too, is going to be just a handful of supplies. And it's going to be anything from like a little thing of lavender aromatherapy oil, it's going to be maybe a couple little like, I'm thinking about like those little like mazes that have little balls you have to get into, something like that. Or also maybe some just little like cards that will say like, listen to your favorite song, jump on the train, whatever the things are that could be options, but they all need to be 2 to 5 minute range. And they can't be something that is so high interest that her attention motivation will be completely hijacked and the transition will be too hard. So we're going to put together her little dopamine toolkit, and that will be her like, oh, I'm facing this hard thing, chewing gum. Like I'm trying to think of the things we put in there that we brainstormed and put in there, and we're going to make it together. And we'll let you know how it goes. But it's kind of like
Great
part
idea.
of working with a kid, thinking about the idea of how to work with the dopamine issue, but also how we recognize certain things just have to be on the end of the thing that are avoiding for her, because the transition's too hard.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I've had one other thought as far as just from a homeschool perspective, and there's sort of like, I wonder if you could think of it as like inviting motivation sometimes, where we'll like set the scene kind of, or light a candle. We're going to light the candle while we do the writing, and then you blow it out when you're done, or kind of the music we've talked about, or, great snacks, especially crunchy ones if you need them to
Yes.
focus, right? But kind of making it feel cozy and inviting versus like do the hard thing. That sometimes it's like, can we bring more connection and warmth, or like I keep thinking about hygge, is that how you say it? Hygge?
Yeah.
Like how you can bring that in to
Mhm.
homework time, or learning time, because that's that's a special thing about home, right? That's a thing we can
Do that. Yeah.
do in a special way in our
Mhm.
houses that we can't necessarily do at school.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Setting
love
the
that. That's
scene,
great.
setting the ambiance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, I think we're probably wrapping up, but what I've heard from all of us is that it's not just one thing. And we often have to change things up because that dopamine, it's like, oh, this is working really well. And then all of a sudden it stops working. So having that menu or that toolbox or the variety of ideas that can be changed up, and as parents to be okay with that it's okay that it needs to be changed up from time to time. And that's where, as parents, if we can help build a toolbox or, a menu of some sort, that knowing, okay, this is maybe going to work for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe a month, but be ready to change it up and to keep communicating. So, yeah.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
one last final thought I want to bring up is how closely tied motivation or struggles of motivation are to shame, and how for any of us that struggle with motivation, that oftentimes brings up a lot of feelings of shame for us, that I don't want my kids or my clients' kids to be walking around with. And that's part of why I'm approaching this with my youngest in terms of like, hey, this is something that your brain does. And it's something that people who have similarly wired brains also struggle with, like normalize.
Yeah.
This is not something that needs to make you beat yourself up, because I beat myself up. I think there may be some shared beating up in this group of
There might be.
Squirrelies that like, oh, I got nothing done again. And oh, this like, oh, I've got nothing to show for my work day. And oh, I suck at, this job or the life,
Yeah.
oh gosh, we're so hard on ourselves, so much shame associated with a struggle with motivation.
And
That
then,
just that.
and then that shame leads back to the avoidance, right? So there's things that
Yeah.
I'm ashamed of, these piles in my office or these bills sitting there that I haven't gotten to. It's like, oh, I don't want to think about that. So I'm going to go do social media or talk to a friend or do anything other than the thing that I don't want to do because it makes me feel bad about myself to look
Yeah.
at it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that on the flip side of that is being able to celebrate what you do get done and have it feel like enough. I
Mhm.
think because our brains sometimes have a hard time prioritizing or knowing like, what do I need to do today?
Yep.
It can always feel like it's not enough, and it always feels like you're behind. And I think that takes practice to decide what is enough, and to give yourself, not to get out of all or nothing thinking and say, I made progress, and that was enough for today. Like,
Yeah.
I did
Progress, not
something.
perfection.
I did something, and that's great. And I think that can sometimes help us break the shame of like, look what I did do today, and can I celebrate
Yeah.
that?
And not
Yeah.
compare ourselves to other people, especially neurotypical people.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I hope this was helpful to people and interesting. Drop your questions below. I love having this.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
It's so great to
Conversation.
share thoughts, ideas, bounce ideas around. I feel like this conversation sparked new ideas for me, things I'd forgotten about or hadn't thought of. So thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me too.
Yeah. Awesome.
You guys are awesome.
Bye.
All right,
Bye.
do we
Oh, wait.
close off with?
Oh.
Who runs the world?
Squirrels.
Squirrels.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Hey.
Bye.